Yeah, how incredible is that? 75 baptisms across all of our campuses last weekend. Just incredible to see what God is doing around Compass. And y'all had 7 here, which is incredible as well. As Andrew said, there were 2 that were planned and 5 just happened. So if you're in the room and you're one of those people, we just want to celebrate you and say thank you for the choice that you made. It's the best decision that you could ever make. Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, my name is Rory, and I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm filling in for Luke this morning. If you have a Bible, I want to invite you to turn to the book of 1 John. 1 John is all the way in the back of your Bible. It's one of the last books. If you don't have a Bible, you can see the scriptures are going to be up here on the screen, or you can simply even Google 1 John on your phone, and it'll pull up. If you have one, though, you can follow along with me. We're going to be in 1 John chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 7. I want you to hear these words. John writes, "Dear friends, I am not writing you a new command, but an old one which you have had since the beginning. This old command is the message you have heard. Yet I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them." Believe it or not, before scientific and medical testing was really developed and at its place, whenever a psych ward was trying to evaluate if a patient was ready to leave or not, they would give them one final test. Whether they were a man or a woman, they would give them this last test, and this test involved a broom closet and a sink. They would go to this broom closet and they would turn the water on so that it began to fill up the sink, and they would put a stopper in the bottom. As they did this, the sink would begin to fill up and slowly begin to start overflowing. They would then grab the person that they were trying to evaluate. They would stick them in this broom closet and hand them a mop. They would then shut the door and come back in a set period of time. Now, when they came back, if they found that the person had this mop and was just mopping up the water, they knew that that person was not ready to be released into the public. Now, I don't know if I trust that this is great testing. Nonetheless, the reason they would do this is because you and I know this person can be standing there with that mop until Jesus comes back, and that water will still be flowing out of the sink. Why? Because there's a stopper in the bottom of the sink. What they were trying to figure out was, does this person have the ability to recognize the root of the problem? Not just stand there and clean it, not just mop until they thought they could get it all up, but did they have the ability, the wherewithal to identify the real issue in their life? This is what they were trying to evaluate, and this is what I want to talk to you about today. See, throughout life, we sort of move, and whether you're a Christian or not, you're trying to figure this faith thing out. This is true. We try to figure out how we want to live our lives, right? What are the values? What are the things we want to sort of build our life around? And I call this the love-hate thing, right? These are 2 pretty contested values, but if you go home and you turn on Netflix and you watch Tidying Up with Marie Kondo, the next day your house will be completely empty. It will look like no one has ever lived there. Right? You'll get rid of all your stuff. Your kids will be like, "Mom, Dad, where are my toys?" And they'll be like, "Those weren't toys. Those were junk. They weren't necessities. We didn't need them." And they're like, "No, these are my toys. What are you doing with my stuff?" Or you'll read a book like The 4-Hour Work Week, and then the next week you won't have a job because your boss will be like, "You weren't here 36 of your 40 hours last week. I don't care what book you've read. You don't have a job here anymore." Or my favorite is when someone's like, I've got this new diet plan, this new eating plan. I'm gonna lose weight. I'm gonna look like I've always intended to look. And then they start telling you about it, and they've got to like drink lemongrass, stand on one foot, spell the word banana at the same time. And if they do this for 9 months consecutively, they will have the body that they have always wanted, which you and I know will never happen because they'll break, they'll stop standing, they'll eat pizza. I don't speak of this from experience or anything. We all are constantly looking for ways to live this out. Even if you're a Christian, you sort of do this, right? To be a Christian means to live like Jesus lived. And then when you say that, you go, well, I don't know if I really even know what that means. We hear someone say, oh, I'm a Christian and I try to live like Jesus. And for some people, that means you're just nice to people, right? You're nice and you're sweet and you post really kitschy things on Instagram and people like you. Or maybe for some people, it means that in their car, there's always Christian radio playing. Maybe for some people, it means that they vote a certain way. They think a certain way. Or maybe even it gets really complex and they say, well, you have to believe these 105 things in order to live like Jesus lived. And so what we end up doing, trying to figure out how to move through life, what values to build our lives around, we either oversimplify or we overcomplicate things. We say it's either all of this stuff you've got to get right, or it's like one thing and that one thing really has no value at all. We have all these competing ideas of how to live. And then we read this passage from 1 John where John says, you can do whatever you want, but if you hate someone, you're actually not living like Jesus did at all. And I don't know about you, but you hear that and you go, whew, well, I don't even think this message is going to apply to me today because I don't hate anyone. I've never hated anyone. But if you're like me, you sort of go, but man, there's a lot of hatred in the world. You go, Rory, look, just watch the news. There's hatred all over. And we go, yeah, there's racism and there's war and there's violence and there's sex trafficking. There's all these things that sort of embody hatred. But I want to make a suggestion to you today. It's that hate is far more common in our lives than we think. And you go, yeah, just look around. But I'm not talking about the hate that's out there. I want to talk about the hate that's closer. That's a little bit closer to home. Now, the interesting thing is you may not call it hate. You may call it something else, and we'll get to some of those things in a minute, but hate actually sits closer to our lives than some of us want to admit. In fact, this is why John actually steps out and writes this letter. A couple things to know. John was one of Jesus's closest disciples, not just amongst the people who followed him, but he was in the inner circle. In fact, when Jesus is hanging on the cross and dying, he looks down at John and says, John, will you take care of my mom after I'm gone? Some of us don't have friends that can even make it to brunch on time, more or less take care of our moms after we're gone. But this is how close Jesus was to John. Most historians say that, and theologians would say that John was called the disciple whom Jesus loved. Not the disciple who loved Jesus, but the disciple that Jesus loved. He had a relationship that was intimate and deep, which means that John had some true core convictions about what it meant to live like this guy named Jesus. And after Jesus' death, he went around and began to start churches. And one of those churches was in a city called Ephesus. It was this huge, booming city. It was near modern-day Turkey, what we would consider modern-day Turkey. And he's leading this church. Now, Ephesus is a super interesting place because it's a massive city. It's a port city. So there's ships and packages and boxes coming in all the time. It looks like an Amazon Prime warehouse. But that also means that people were coming in and out all the time. So all these competing worldviews are sort of colliding right here in this space. Which meant in John's church, maybe similar to us this morning, there would have been people with varying ideas of how to live life. There would have been Jews who were deeply rooted in the law and they believed in Jesus, but they were going, you got to follow all of the rules. These were the rule followers that annoy all of us. And if you're like, rule followers are great, you're a rule follower and that's fine. Or there were the other people, the Gentiles, the Greeks, who they had heard about Jesus and were compelled by him, but they didn't have all the baggage of the rules and all of that, so they were like, we can just do whatever we want. So there's these competing worldviews just in John's church, but even in the entire city, some people believed that the city itself, some people say it was sort of built up on a hill. It had these mythological beliefs about it, that it was sort of a holy, divine place. And because of this, all of these competing worldviews and religions started setting up temples. The Roman Empire, the cult of the Roman Empire had a temple there. The Egyptian gods and goddesses had one. The Greek god of Artemis had one. There were all of these competing worldviews. Can you see what's happening in this city. There's all these competing ways and options of how to live. And of course, that sort of creeps in to the church. Becomes like a buffet line of options. Like I can go to church on Sunday, go worship the Romans on Monday, and I should just cover all my bases and we'll be fine by the end of the week. What that left people with is a lack of understanding of what values were really supposed to drive their life. What really was supposed to be sort of bringing them and pushing them forward. And because of that, John's church begins to experience rifts and disagreements. People who hate each other, people begin to leave and fight and quarrel. And so when John writes this is what's going on in the background. So John steps out and he addresses this in 1 John chapter 2, verse 7. Let's throw it up on the screen. He says, dear friends, anytime someone starts something with dear friends, they're trying to butter you up. I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you have had since the beginning. This old command is the message you have heard, yet I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. So John starts this section. He says, I've got a new command for you, but it's an old command. Well, it's really an old command, but it's kind of a new command. These biblical writers are just, they can't ever get to the point. I've got a new command, but it's an old command. What he's saying is there's an old command, and it now, because of Jesus, his life, what he's done, his death and resurrection, it now has new meaning to it. It's new, but it's old. It's like when you go and get a new car, but it's a used car, which means someone else didn't want it. It was old to them, but now it's new to you. You think it's the greatest. They thought it was the worst. It's a new thing, but it's an old thing. In fact, I read this recently. During the Renaissance, 1600s, these teenagers would have what were called alba amicorum, which means nothing to you now because it's in Latin, but it'll mean something in about 45 seconds. They had this thing called alba amicorum, which were these books that they would put signatures and collect autographs and have tokens of affection in, and they would have them mostly during school when they went off to university. Now what they would do is they would pass these books around. And their friends would get them and they would write jokes. They would gossip about each other. They would tell jokes. They would share lyrics from their favorite songs. They would draw pictures. They would even, get this, argue about politics. Alba amicorum in Latin simply means friend's book, believe it or not. This was Facebook far before we had Facebook. It's an old thing that we think is new. It's a new thing that is actually really old. It's an old command that's a new command. This is what John is saying. It's this old thing, but it has new meaning because of what Jesus has done. Now, you guys are like, he's really not getting to the point on what this old new thing is. In order to understand the old thing and how it's now a new thing, we have to go to the book of Leviticus, which if you don't know where Leviticus is, it's right where you left off in your Read Your Bible in a Year plan. This is what the book of Leviticus says. Chapter 19, verse 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people. And then this, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now you hear that in Leviticus, and some of you thought that Jesus came up with love your neighbor as yourself, but this was a command that had existed far before Jesus was even born. This command was stated when Israel was traveling through the wilderness, and they began to come across different people and even experience conflict within their own people. And what God says to them is, you are to love anyone that you find around you, anyone in your midst, you're to love them. The way that you would love yourself and care for yourself, you're to love them. Now, what the implication of this is that you are to love anyone, even the people you may encounter who might bring you harm. Now, when the Israelites would have read this and talked about it, it would have been dramatic and profound. When Jesus then echoes it later, it would have been dramatic and profound for him to look at these people and say, you are to love anyone that you find in your midst, even those who have the potential to hurt you and those who have, get this, already hurt you. You are to love them with everything that you have. He then echoes this command later in his life when he's explaining to his disciples that he is about to die. Go ahead and throw this up. This is from John 13. He says, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Jesus is saying, listen, because I am God in the flesh and I have loved you, you are now to reciprocate that love all over the place. And they would have heard this and been amazed. Not that they're to love, but that this God of the universe has now loved them so deeply that they're meant to turn it around to the world around them. And you and I hear that and we go, yeah, but did Jesus know how hard it is to love people? Like, it sounds great when you're writing a sermon and you're standing up here for 30 minutes, but did he know how hard that would be? Because loving people is flat out difficult. I mean, you get married and you commit to love your spouse, and then they say something that's so deeply hurtful. Or in some cases, they even leave. This person you've committed love to is now not there. Or you commit to love your kids, but then you feel like your kid is going down a path that's becoming destructive to you and your family and to themselves, and you go, I don't even know how to feel. You commit to love your friends, and then they talk behind your back, and you try to figure out how to stay friends with them, but it just sort of gets worse and worse. They insult you, they fight with you. Man, loving people is just flat out hard. I mean, in fact, some of you, I don't know if any of you in the room got baptized last week, but you probably had this moment, or if you've been baptized, you'll know what I'm talking about, where you go down under the water and you come back up and the sun is shining and there's doves, and they were there. You didn't see them, but they were there. And you go, man, life is just so good. There's unlimited potential for goodness. And then you got home and you got in an argument with your spouse. And then Monday you got on 820 and remembered why you hate people and God should have never given us automobiles. Or you get to work and you see your boss and you're reminded of how much you hate him or her. Right? Loving people is easy in theory, but then you have to interact with your ex, and all those feelings of hurt and trauma come rushing back. Loving people is easy until it hurts. Before we can really talk about love, though, we have to do what John did, and we have to talk about the opposite of it, which is hate. I prepared an encouraging message for you on hate. Listen, it's interesting because John writes this in 1 John verse 9, actually. He says this. He says, anyone who claims to be in the light, which is a metaphor for being in a relationship with Jesus, but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. Listen, what John is trying to say is that we have these moments of recommitment and where we get hurt and we get angry and we feel hate and we go, you know what, I'm going to push through, I'm going to sort of barrel through it. But John says you can't just ignore that feeling. I think what John is trying to say to us is that in your life, hatred cannot even have a place to hang out. Hatred can't even have a small space where it can find a place to grow. And you hear me talk about hate and you're like, man, hate is such a strong word. I don't even know if this is gonna apply to me. I've never really hated anyone. But if you have kids, you've had that moment where you pick them up from school and they hop in the car and they go, man, mom, dad, I hate my teacher. Teachers get such a bad rap. They go, man, I hate my teacher. Or you have a friend who comes over and they go, man, so-and-so said this about me, they did this, and you go, man, I hate them. And if you've ever been around someone who said, I hate them, you go, oh, no, don't say that. You don't hate anybody. You know, I don't know about you, but my wife and I, we have this consistent fight when we're trying to pick a restaurant to go to for dinner. And I'm sure we're alone in that. I'm sure none of you have that problem. And every time we have this debate, the word hate gets thrown out, mostly by me, not at her. But I'll say, where do you want to go? And she'll go, I don't care, you decide. And I go, what if you pick some places and I'll tell you what I think about them? And she'll go, well, what if we go to Chick-fil-A? And I go, I hate Chick-fil-A. Which isn't true. Look, some people are like, oh my gosh. I don't actually hate it. I'm just like, I don't really want to go there. So, well, what if we go to like Fresco's or something on 377? I hate that place. I don't hate it. Again, I actually really like it. I'm just like, I don't really want to go there. It's not what I want. And we go back and forth constantly where I'm just saying ridiculous things that I hate. Or if you talk to someone and you say, hey, do you like this movie? And they go, man, I hate that movie. And you're like, you don't even know the movie. You don't even know it. But we throw the word hate around pretty loosely, and it shocks some of us when we hear it. We're caught off guard by it. And I think we're right to be caught off guard. It's a strong word. Some of us, I don't think, realize just how strong it actually is. I read a psychologist's definition of hate, and she wrote this. She said, hate involves an appraisal that a person or group is evil. While hate relates to other negative emotions, it also has some unique features, such as the motivation to eliminate the object of your hate. See, this is what's so unfortunate about hate, is that it never just stays an emotion. Some of you even think about some relationships or friendships that you have right now that are maybe experiencing some conflict, and you realize that the emotion of negativity has sort of slowly grown. But the problem is we don't ever start at hate, right? Very few of us have ever woken up one morning and said, I hate this. Very few of us. It slowly builds up and starts over time, which is why John wrote this later in this exact same letter. If you're following along with me, we're going to jump to chapter 3 real fast just to read a few verses. Chapter 3, verse 11, he says, for this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Now, if you grew up in church, you've heard the story of Cain and Abel, but if you haven't, let me just revisit it for a second. Cain and Abel is one of the first stories in the scripture where we really see hatred sort of show up out of nowhere. These two brothers, one's named Cain, one's named Abel, they both go to God with sacrifices. And Abel, he brings the best of the best, and he lays it down, and God is pleased with his sacrifice. Cain, though, his other brother, shows up and brings the scraps of what he had. Now, Cain was harvesting plants, so it was kind of scraps anyways, but he brought it, and it wasn't good enough. Now, the reason it wasn't good enough wasn't because God looked at Cain and said, you're not good enough, but he did say, you've only brought me the leftovers. Your brother brought me the best of the best, you brought me the leftovers. And this infuriates Cain, so much so that he actually ends up murdering his brother. And this is what we normally think of when we think about this story, but the truth is, before there was murder, there was hatred. So the question must be asked, before hatred, was there something else going on? Now, the interesting thing is, in the Jewish tradition, the legend of Cain and Abel says that Cain and Abel were at odds their entire life. That Abel was sort of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed varsity quarterback who had a 4.0 GPA, although I don't know many varsity quarterbacks with a 4.0 GPA. That was Abel. And Cain was the smelly middle school boy who ate fish sticks and had Velcro shoes. That was the relationship of these two brothers. Cain lived a life of hurt. So when he brings this sacrifice to God and it's rejected, Cain, I'm not pardoning his actions, but Cain has this moment where he's rejected. He's insufficient. He's not as good as his brother. Here's what I believe that story tells us, is that hate is almost always preceded by something. For some of us, it's jealousy and envy. For some of us, it's greed. For others, maybe it's bitterness and skepticism, or just disregard and disrespect of people. See, hatred is always preceded by something, right? There are those thoughts that you have in your head where you go, man, I wish I had what that person had. I would do anything to have what that person had. Or wait until my boss realizes he should have never passed me up for that promotion. Just wait, one day I'll make more money than they do. Or when you do those things where you go, man, I'm done with them. That's what hatred is. It's total disregard. Man, I'm done with that person. And the unfortunate thing is when these things begin to take root in our life, hatred now has a place to grow. In fact, this is what I want to tell you that I believe to be true is that hatred is always preceded by hurt. It's always preceded by hurt. This is why if you talk to someone who's divorced, they don't know if they hate their former spouse, but they do know that they've been hurt. They know that they've been bruised, they've been emotionally destroyed. And they may use the word hate to describe that relationship, and I would argue that they don't know if they hate them, but they do know they've been hurt. If you talk to a kid who was bullied or is bullied at school, they'll tell you that they hate the kids who bully them. And it's mostly because they're hurt. Their peers, these people who are supposed to be moving through life with them, are the ones who are abusing them. Listen, hatred is almost always preceded by hurt. But here's what we tend to do. We experience hurt in our lives, and instead of dealing with the root of the problem, instead of dealing with the plug that's in the sink, we just get the mop out and start going to work. We're like, man, I don't need these people. I can make it on my own. I'll be fine. I don't need to go to counseling. I don't need to talk to anybody about it. I'll just clean this all up, because we know that we would rather look like everything is fine than actually deal with what's going on. God forbid we show up to church and actually have something wrong. So we got to clean up. We got to make sure everything's fine. In fact, most of us, I would say, we mop a little, throw the mop in the closet, shut the door, and then walk away. The problem is the longer we walk away, the longer we don't deal with the plug that's in the drain, the real root of the issue, the hurt just slowly begins to build. And it leads to what John calls a life of darkness. Verse 11, throw it up here on the screen. He says, but anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. Listen, when you refuse to deal with the hurt in your life, when you want to follow Jesus and these are the values you want to carry on, but you don't deal with the hurt, then hatred begins to grow. And John says you end up stumbling around in the dark. In fact, a few weeks ago, my wife and I decided that we should redo our master bathroom. And by my wife and I of course, mean my wife. And she said that we were gonna do this remodel together. She said, Rory, we'll do this together. And by we'll do this together, she meant you'll do this on your own. And so we've started doing this. And when we started, we did all the demolition last weekend. And when we started doing this, I had to shut the electricity off in the bathroom, but I'm not very handy, like at all. I'm not even sure how screws work. I shut the electricity off to what I thought was the bathroom, but I actually shut it off to a whole side of our house. And again, the idiot that I am, I didn't find this out until it was the middle of the night and I got up to use the restroom. Now, I don't know about you, but if you have kids at home, you know that all the toys that they have are just small and made of plastic when it's daytime and you can see them. But when it's nighttime and you can't, your living room immediately turns from a beautiful place into like a back alley that's covered with razor blades. And so I'm tiptoeing around in the dark, but not coordinated, step on almost every toy I can find, fall all over the place. The kid's asleep, my wife's asleep, I'm trying not to make noise. I'm stumbling all over in this darkness. And this is what John says most of us look like when we don't deal with the hurt in our lives. You think you've got it all together, but what most of us aren't seeing is you walking around in the darkness, stumbling over everything that you've allowed to stay there. See, when we choose to ignore the hurt in our lives, hatred, it finds a place to hang out. But here's what I believe about the gospel, and this is why this is so good, is that there is a God of love who sacrifices himself out of love so that you may know and have a loving relationship with him. It has the power to take the darkest, most hurtful situations and bring them hope. Which is why I believe this. If hatred is always preceded by hurt, then love is preceded by hope. Love is preceded by hope. It's this sense that things can get better. In those relationships where you feel like there is so much brokenness and so much hurt and so much pain, it can get better. See, love is always preceded by confidence and contentment and gentleness. When there's conflict, you don't step in to fight, you step in to find peace. I believe the truth of the gospel is that this is how Jesus sees all of us. When Jesus encounters his disciples and invites them to follow him, he doesn't look at their past and their brokenness, he looks at their potential. When Jesus meets this Samaritan woman at the well, he doesn't see her brokenness, her failed marriages, and the political and religious reasons to not engage with her. He looks at her and sees the potential of who she could be. When Jesus feeds thousands of people, he doesn't see them as burdens. He sees them as opportunities for God's glory to be revealed. He loves people with hope. And when Jesus sees a woman who's been accused of adultery laying in the dirt, surrounded by religious leaders who are ready to stone her, Jesus steps in and gets on her level and says, I know you've messed up, but I know that God has something better for your life. See, Jesus' example of love is built on hope. And for so many of us, what we need to stop doing is looking at these broken relationships in our lives with hate and start viewing them with hope. That marriage that you're in right now, that you're afraid is going to fall to pieces, God is looking at you and going, you have to see them with hope. Your kid that you're concerned about their future at college, you have to look at them with hope. Those people at your job that you're like, I don't know if I can even be around them anymore. You've continued to look at them with hate and contempt, but you haven't looked at them with hope. To view people with hope is to view them through the lens of the gospel. To view people with hope is to see them the way that Jesus sees them. See, some of us have gone far too long viewing relationships without any hope. We've allowed hatred to hang out. We've allowed hurt from other people to linger. That boyfriend, that girlfriend who broke your heart a few years ago, man, you're still bitter. That boss who fired you, maybe without any good reason, you're still angry. You tell the story every chance you get. We cannot allow hatred to hang out, because where there's hatred, there's hurt. So here's what I want to do as we close today. Churches all around the world will close their services today with what's called a benediction. And a benediction is simply words or a prayer that sort of mark what we've experienced in this space to help propel you out into the world. And so we're gonna get a little old school. This might be weird for some of you. You don't pray out loud, you don't talk out loud. I mean, you talk out loud, but you don't do it a lot. What I'm gonna ask you to do, the words are gonna be on the screen. I simply want to ask you to repeat after me. This is a prayer to God. This is a demand from us of who we want to be. Because the truth is, we can stand in here and talk about love until I'm blue in the face and until you're asleep. But if we don't figure out how to come back to that space when we're interacting with people, when we're on 820, when we're in our offices, when we're at home, none of it matters. So I want to invite you to repeat after me. We're going to throw these words up. May the love of God be present in our lives. Where there is hurt, bring us healing. Where there is pain, bring us peace. Where there is hate, bring us hope. As we grow in his love, light our path through the darkness. Amen. Thank you, guys.